Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. I talked when talking about the dictator's dilemma of this grievance, that the grievance that lies under the latent system. So you think about the visible system. We see the riots, we see the protests, we see what's going on. But driving that is the latent system, which is invisible. It's hard to see. It's not that it doesn't exist, but it's very hard to see. And this grievance that gets transformed into kinetic energy when protests happen, when riots happen, I call that the iceberg theory. You know, George Floyd dies, or Breonna Taylor dies, or Ahmaud dies, or even back in Ferguson, Michael Brown dies. These are the tips of the iceberg. And even though those individual cases can be argued in a legal sense, right, wrong, or indifferent, you know, just or unjust, I think obviously George Floyd was murder. Breonna Taylor was a SWAT police raid in the wrong house. I mean, you have hard to argue those, but getting away from arguing the individual points, it's important to recognize that these trigger points on the ice are just the very, very tip of a large iceberg. And what I wanted to show was something, I've done a lot of work on systemic disparities in violence, because my research is in violence and instability. And it's important to understand what this iceberg looks like. So what I wanted to do was make the iceberg visible. And that's not easy, because the data is kind of like, reporters don't think in this way. A lot of sociologists sort of get this, but their data is not accessible, hidden in journals. So what I wanted to do is start with the tip of the iceberg. This is from the Washington Post police shooting database. They have, in 2015, they began tracking every police shooting they could find in the US. It had been a very opaque subject. We didn't have a lot of good data. Police agencies were naturally very reluctant to share. And we didn't know how many times people were being shot, how many were black, how many were white, how many were unarmed. There wasn't good data, except for persistent data, except for occasional research. This is what the Washington Post currently has as the stats. You know, you can see here, this is a per capita per million. And before people ask questions, I'm going to go through a lot here. So hold the questions until can I get it, because I know a lot of, well, what about this? Well, we'll get to that. So this is the tip of the iceberg. This is the deaths, the disparate deaths by police interactions. And you can see here that blacks, 31 per million die from police interaction, over 1,200 killed in total, versus whites are 13 per million. So you're talking about a disparity. Now, keep in mind, more whites are being killed by number, but the white population is also 3 times the size of the black population. So what we're looking at is a per capita that adjusts for their population, and the disparity is the difference between these experiences. If everything was equal and normal, you would have the same amount per population. You know, if you assume it's just a normal statistical random distribution, it should not be affected by race. And this clearly shows it is affected by race. Blacks killed at not quite 3 times the rate. Hispanics are almost twice the rate. And this trend has been going on all 5 years. The Washington Post has been recording this. It's interesting. Every year, about 1,000 people are killed by the police. Now, a lot of these, most of them, are justified shootings. You can go to the Washington Post database and you can look up every single shooting. They have a lot of criteria to say, you know, was the suspect fleeing the scene? Was it an armed confrontation or felonious stop, or violence was involved? You know, attack the police. Was it unarmed? Was it a random stop? Was it just a, you know, search? And I think the ones that, you know, obviously drive the media, George Floyd was a $20 counterfeit bill that we're not even sure if he knew was counterfeit. You know, the same thing with in New York City, in Breonna Taylor. So a lot of these deaths are not necessarily high risk situations where I mean, Breonna Taylor was a SWAT team, but a lot of the other ones are just normal everyday interactions that end up with death. And the police here are, again, about 1,000 a year, pretty consistent over all 5 years that we've been tracking. So when we look, though, the rate of deaths, we can talk about the rate of deaths with police interaction as a rate per encounter. And, you know, you can think about, for every 10,000 times a population encounters the police, what's the rate of injury and fatality? And a big arguing point that's out there right now is that per 10,000 police encounters, racial difference doesn't make a lot of difference. And you can see that here. I put in the upper left, these are white non-Hispanic, upper right, blacks, lower left, white Hispanic, and lower right, Native American. These are the designations that are used in the research for the major ethnic groups. And you can see here, injured per 10,000 stops and arrests and fatal per 10,000 stops and arrests, 1.5 people are injured per 10,000 stops and arrests, 0.7 are killed. For white, about the same for black, pretty close for white, Hispanic, much lower for Native American, but the note in the research was that that was believed to be by bad reporting, that they weren't getting all the data into the Uniform Crime Report. This is based off the FBI Uniform Crime Report. So people will argue, hey, yeah, you're saying that, you know, the rates aren't that different per 10,000, so why is this a big deal? Well, this is the iceberg. You can make the iceberg visible. It's the number of police interactions with that population before you get to the point that you'd use the 10,000 that matters. So what this shows is this is the iceberg, right? This is the funnel. The systemic funnel I talk about is we do more arrests and stops for other races than we do for white. So again, same block. If you're white, there will be 355 arrests per 10,000 and about 148 stops per 10,000. That's the baseline for the white Americans. But if you're black, you will be arrested. There are arrests 1,100 per 10,000 and 217 stops. Now remember, a stop doesn't always result in arrest. This can be stopped, a harassment, and let go. But many of the deaths have occurred on these sort of small stops, small issue stops. The bumper's off, the light's broken. You took a run, you know, you were going a little bit too fast. And you can see here that the arrests per 10,000, the interactions with the police, and these are per 10K populations. So blacks are almost 4 times more likely to have a police interaction or arrest. Sure, once you have an interaction with the police, the rates are about the same, but there's a lot more interactions with blacks with the police than with the white. Same thing with Hispanics. They're almost twice as much, and Native Americans as well, much higher. So these are the systemic funnels, and this is nationwide. The research this article comes from it's linked in the comments. When I talk about the tip of the iceberg, right, this is the actual iceberg. George Floyd may be down here in a fatal encounter, but the community that he lives in is dealing with these disparate arrests and stops per 10,000. And this is spread out over the entire United States. When you go to a city that ends up being a flashpoint like Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, you want to look at the iceberg in that city. And because the Department of Justice investigations that happened after the Michael Brown shooting, we have a good idea of the iceberg in Ferguson as it existed when the protest came up about Michael Brown. So what I want to do next is show the this is Ferguson, and it's simply comparing whites and blacks now. In Ferguson, it's not a big town. It's only like 20,000 people. The charges per 10,000 for whites are about 8,700. This is the amount of times police charged people. There's only 7,000 whites in there. So again, this is a per capita. I don't want someone to say, well, that's, you know, per 10,000, there's not even 10,000 people in the city. It's adjusted. It's a normalizing thing, so we compare. But 8,700 per 10,000 whites were charged. 2,800 vehicles stopped. Vehicle searches, about 142, and arrested as a result of the vehicle searches per 10,000 population, 114, right? So now look at the iceberg as blacks see it. Same city, same police force, same 10,000 populations, it's normalized, but nearly 2.5 times, maybe close, a little bit less than 3 times charges per 10,000 people. The vehicle stops per 10,000, over double, right? And the vehicle searches per 10,000, nearly 6 times as much. And the arrested as a result, again, 6 times. Now, someone's going to say, well, you know, maybe they were committing crime. You can look in the data. If they searched a vehicle, in white stops, contraband was found 30% of the time. In black stops, 24%. So it's not that there are more criminality in these stops. It's the sheer number of stops and charges and searches and arrests. And this is the iceberg that fuels this grievance that then gets, you know, manifested when someone like Michael Brown gets shot. Now, there is, you know, the shooting itself was later determined to be self-defense, and I think there is a good argument that was a self-defensive shooting. But that doesn't discount the systemic disparate policing that's going on in the city itself. That doesn't discount this iceberg effect, which explains why it was reacted the way it did. You cannot look at these interactions only as someone died. Why is everyone so upset? Or, well, that turns out to be a valid death, but why is it? It's this iceberg here that goes on. And This is not limited just to Ferguson or certain crime types. I've done this study for many, many different types of crime. And in fact, does anyone want to guess what one of the most disparate, I mean, liberals are kind of in a pinch here because they come down on the side of Black Lives Matter, but they're often supporting causes that create these icebergs themselves. Does anyone want to guess what one of the top most disparate criminal prosecution types there are from racial disparity? It's going to surprise some people. Well, this is the entire United States. This is sentencing disparity now between blacks and Hispanics versus whites. And I point out the second highest one here, firearms. Almost as much as drugs, and in fact, in some cases, it can be several times more than drugs. Everyone understands the drug war is bad, but what they don't understand is that the gun control effort is just as bad. And so this shows out the disparity of treatment between blacks and Hispanics versus white. This is the iceberg across all crimes. And you see, you know, if you're a white person, I'm advising you stay away from these crimes down here because they're going to get you: gambling, child pornography, environmental wildlife, food and drug. Yeah, make sure you're don't be selling your whole milk there. But you know, when you talk about disparate policing on violent crime, serious crime, it's almost always disparate against the minority populations, the ethnic populations. I think for firearms nationally, it's something like blacks and Hispanics make up 28% of the population, but get charged with something like 70% of the crimes for gun control violations. And this is just one manifestation of this iceberg, the hugely disparate policing. And it's not to say that whites don't commit firearm violations. I could go, you know, where I am right now, I could probably go in a 3-block area in a largely white area and find many firearm violations of unregistered firearms, ammunition not held well. The trick is all those stops, those police interactions that are at the tip of the funnel, more searches, more stops, more vehicle stops, they lead into this arresting pattern that creates this disparity. So it's not that there is a higher criminality degree as a baseline among the population, it's that there's a higher policing on top of that. That creates this disparate effect. And liberal states are not immune to this. I am a resident of Massachusetts, and Massachusetts tends to have a problem of patting itself on the back and saying, well, we're not like those southern states. And this is the Massachusetts racial disparity. Weapons and firearms, gun control in Massachusetts is the most disparate policing in the state. It's twice as disparate as drug offenses. Blacks and Hispanics, I think, only make up 12% of the population in Massachusetts, but account for something like 80% of the firearm enforcement. And you can see here how it breaks down. But this is not something that is as easily categorized when it comes to these laws and policing. It's not something that's as easily categorized, I think, as well. It's South or urban or poor or anything like that. These things really cross the gamut. And so from the reform efforts you see coming out that they're largely targeted at the systemic funnel. And you know, Campaign Zero came about probably 3 or 4 years ago. That is a series of reform for police behavior itself: body cameras, more community policing. People are saying they've been ineffective, and the problem with implementing something in a large bureaucracy like a nationwide police force is it takes time. I can see the argument they're ineffective because police officers are turning off their body cams, or when there's a shooting, magically the body cameras are off. What we're seeing now, though, is because of those regulations, police are being fired and or arrested for violating. The Louisville police chief was fired because his troops had the body camera off when a civilian was shot by the police. And so I think there's an argument whether those reforms are doing enough. But when it comes to the hashtag defund the police, which is a horrible name, what they're really talking about is attacking that systemic funnel. It's about making sure the police aren't the major interacting point with these communities when most of these stops are for petty things, or they might be mental health issues or substance abuse issues, or where services. The argument is we can decompose the police force from being the major social services provider for these poor communities, pull them back, save them for truly violent crime and murder, things like that. And then what's remaining, the funding that went for those police services will go better to social services. I don't know if I buy necessarily that you can ramp up social services to be that effective to solve that. These are major societal level issues: mental health, substance abuse, poverty. These are challenges. I don't think it's going to be as much as just shifting, but it's not a bad idea. Anything you can do to reduce that interaction rate, that encounter rate, especially when it's petty stuff, will have a cascade effect through the funnel of less stops, less searches, less arrests, less injuries, less hospitalizations, and less deaths. And that's probably where I think the defund the police movement is heading towards, is to reduce those numbers of interactions. But I think we need to be clear here. A lot of people are saying the flip side of the iceberg is, well, the police are maintaining law and order. That's a very challenging argument to make if you look at the data in terms of like clearance rates. And I don't have the data here in front of me, but I may do it on a follow-up. The clearance rate for things like murders range between 40% and 60%. So we can argue that murders are hard, but for rapes, the clearance rate of police nationwide is like 20%. For a lot of burglary and property crimes, it's 15%. The theory that police create law and order, I think, is subject to valid debate at this point. They certainly are present, and under extreme circumstances, yes, you want to have like this domestic terrorism incident on Saturday where, you know, guys going around with IEDs and firearms. You need an armed response to that. But for the vast majority of interactions that are non-criminal in nature, there's probably better services that can be used. And even for the ones that are criminal, they're generally documenting, collecting evidence, and then either sitting on it in a backlog of kits that they never get to, or not really effectively handling it. So I think the protest, now that the violence has reduced associated with the riots, police escalation, the protests are gaining steam. You're going to see a shift to this disparate policing angle and the systemic funnel angle. And I think they're going to move to decide about reforming. How do we get less police interactions? How do we eliminate some of these laws that don't seem to be serving a purpose but are sort of enabling these activities? That's going to be the focus going forward. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.